I was so glad you started this book with a conversation about the gospel, because sometimes, oddly, that could get short shrift in homiletics textbook. We talk about the how and we don't talk about the what. But it's interesting to think about what it means to be Christian in relation to practice, because so much of my understanding of Christian is shaped around my faith as a gift. And so I'm really wondering how you all think about Christian in light of that tension between practice and gift. How are those two things related in the work of preaching?
So for me, I've always turned to Luke 4, and where Jesus comes out of the wilderness and shows up in the synagogue, and he is given a scroll and he reads from Isaiah, and he not only declares himself as the good news arrived in a community of pain and crisis, but I think gives us a significant outline of what the vision of preaching ought resemble. So if, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news or proclaim good news to the poor. So good news, glad tidings, ought to have some direction toward the poor, and proclaiming release to the captive, recovery of sight to the blind, be that literally blind or spiritually blind. There ought to be some sense that the gospel does something and can do something, can transform human life.
So the gift leads to these kinds of practices of justice and liberation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what worship space is, right? We come just as we are, broken, hurting, struggling, failing. We come into that worship space just the way we are. And in that space, God meets us, he pours us his grace, he renews us, he transforms us, he challenges us, and we're sent out back into the world to practice, to live that out. So I think you're right that there's always going to be this dynamic interaction between the gift we've received and the grace we have to live out.
Yeah.
And I think preaching is that very climactic moment in worship that shows us those two coming together, I think.
And I think where we lose sight of being Christian is when we replace anything with Jesus. When anything becomes an idol more than Christ. And so one of the ways I think we can encourage our students to really think through, are they being Christian, is as a result of listening to the sermon, do I love Jesus more? Am I willing to obey him, even in the hard things? So not shying away from difficult texts, preaching prophetically. Is this what God said? If it is, I'm going to be his voice verbatim. And maybe that can be a practice that we can try to include in our preaching. Am I truly saying what the text is saying? Even if it means pastoral rebuke, even in a loving way, am I directing them closer to a relationship with Jesus Christ?
I loved your point about idolatry. One of the really important practices in my sermon work and in how I work with a text is actually disrupting or dislocating my first take on a passage enough that I myself get again in that posture of dependence and listening and readiness for a living God to step onto the scene. You take a text and have a conversation with someone that you don't agree with about it. A place where you're going to have differences of opinion. And the point is not to have conflict. The point, though, is to remind yourself of your limits and your humanity and the questions you're not even asking. Yeah. So that you begin then to have a sense in your own self, not just that I want to preach about a living God, but I've met a living God who has met my need in this process. So for me, I felt the need to build in practices in my preparation that intentionally do that to me.
One of the things that we can just own is that there are probably allegiances and alliances and misplaced desires that we don't see that others do see. And so in order for us to for us to be shaken loose of pseudo-gospels that we might sometimes be tempted to preach, we should be asking questions like, well, who is speaking into our own walk with God, our own discipleship journey, who's speaking into our own preaching, challenging us or inviting us to be set free from those things?